The gruesome final hours of J.E.B. Stuart, hidden from history books. The Cavalier of Dixie. There are men in history who seem too alive to ever die. Men who burn so brightly that the world cannot imagine a darkness that could extinguish them. James Ewell Brown Stuart was one of those men. To the Confederate South, J.E.B. Stuart was not merely a general. He was a legend walking on two legs. At a time when the Confederate cause desperately needed heroes, Stuart gave them one, in full color, complete with golden spurs, a scarlet-lined cape, and a hat so gloriously plumed with ostrich feathers that soldiers on both sides of the conflict could spot him from a mile away. He rode into battle the way other men walked into a ballroom, with total confidence, a wide grin on his bearded face, and a banjo player often trotting right behind him. Born on February 6, 1833, in Patrick County, Virginia, Stuart grew up in a world that valued honor, courage, and loyalty above all else. He entered West Point in 1850, where he crossed paths with a man who would define his destiny, Robert E. Lee, then the Academy's superintendent. The two formed a bond that would prove unbreakable through years of war, blood, and grief. Stuart graduated in 1854, ranked 13th in his class of 46. He was commissioned into the cavalry, a fitting choice for a man who seemed to have been born in the saddle. He served on the frontier, fought Cheyenne warriors in Kansas, and even took a bullet during a mounted attack in 1857, a wound he wore like a badge of pride. In 1859, he stood at Robert E. Lee's side during the capture of the radical abolitionist John Brown at Harper's Ferry, one of the most volatile moments in American history, a spark that would ignite the coming war. When Virginia seceded from the Union in April 1861, Stuart made his choice without hesitation. His father-in-law, Colonel Philip St. George Cooke, chose to remain with the Union Army, a decision that infuriated Stuart so deeply that he later renamed his own son, erasing the man's name from his family entirely. Stuart wrote to his brother-in-law with chilling clarity, "He will regret it but once, and that will be continuously." The Civil War was Stuart's stage, and he performed upon it magnificently. The eyes and ears of Robert E. Lee. In June 1862, Stuart accomplished something that had never been done before, and would never quite be done again. He led his cavalry on a complete circumnavigation of the Union Army of the Potomac. Over 3 days and nearly 150 miles of riding, Stuart looped entirely around General George McClellan's massive army, gathering intelligence, disrupting supply lines, capturing prisoners, and humiliating the federal command, all while losing fewer than a handful of men. The nation, North and South, was electrified. Robert E. Lee called Stuart the eyes and ears of the army. It was not flattery, it was fact. Lee depended upon Stuart's cavalry for reconnaissance in a way that no other commander could replicate. When Stuart sent back information about Union positions, Lee moved. When Stuart said a flank was vulnerable, Lee struck. Their partnership was the engine of Confederate success in the Eastern Theater, and it drove victories at Second Bull Run, Fredericksburg, and the stunning triumph at Chancellorsville in May 1863. But Stuart was not merely a spy on horseback. He was a fighter of extraordinary ferocity and skill. At Brandy Station in June 1863, the largest cavalry battle ever fought on American soil, Stuart's troopers clashed with nearly 12,000 Union horsemen in a swirling, all-day melee of saber charges, pistol fire, and desperate hand-to-hand combat. Stuart's forces held the field, but the battle shook him. The Union cavalry was no longer the amateur force it had been at the war's beginning. They were learning. They were growing stronger. Then came Gettysburg, and the shadow that would follow Stuart for the rest of his life. In the summer of 1863, General Lee launched his second invasion of the North, hoping to deal a decisive blow that might end the war. Stuart, eager to repeat his glorious rides of the previous year, launched an ambitious cavalry raid that took him deep into Union territory. The ride was spectacular in its execution, but it left Lee blind during the most critical days of the campaign. The Army of Northern Virginia stumbled into the Battle of Gettysburg largely without knowing where the Union forces were, how many there were, or where they were going. The catastrophic 3-day battle ended in the bloodiest Confederate defeat of the war. The blame was never fully assigned, and historians still argue. But Stuart knew. When he finally reported to Lee on July 2, dusty, weary, riding at the head of his exhausted troopers, Lee raised his hand and said simply, "You are here at last." The words carried more weight than any reprimand. Stuart, by some accounts, had tears in his eyes. He spent the next year trying to redeem himself. He fought harder, rode faster, and burned with a need to prove that he was still the cavalier the South believed him to be. He would get his final chance, and his final battle, in the spring of 1864. The shadow of death. The spring of 1864 began with blood. General Ulysses S. Grant had assumed command of all Union armies, and he brought with him a new, merciless philosophy of war: hit hard, keep hitting, never stop. Grant launched the Overland Campaign in early May, a grinding, horrific series of engagements through the Virginia wilderness that left tens of thousands of men dead within weeks. Stuart was already exhausted. The Army of Northern Virginia had been fighting and bleeding for 3 years. Many of his best officers were gone. His beloved friend Stonewall Jackson had died exactly 1 year before, on May 10, 1863, after being accidentally shot by his own men. Stuart had mourned Jackson deeply, calling his death a national calamity. Now, on May 7, 1864, a new threat emerged. General Philip Sheridan, aggressive, stocky, and brimming with confidence, had boasted to General Meade that if given free rein, he could thrash hell out of Stuart any day. Meade, exasperated by Sheridan's ego, finally let him try. Sheridan was given 10,000 cavalry troopers and an open road south toward Richmond. It was a trap. And Stuart knew it. Sheridan wasn't just raiding. He was hunting. He wanted to draw Stuart into a battle, defeat him decisively, and break the back of Confederate cavalry power in the east. By moving toward Richmond itself, he knew Stuart would have no choice but to fight. On the evening of May 10, Stuart stopped at the home of Colonel Edmund Fontaine near Beaver Dam Station. His wife Flora was there, along with their young children. The war had kept them apart for months. Stuart dismounted, kissed his wife, held his children, and allowed himself, just for a few minutes, to be something other than a general. But the minutes ran out. The thunder of the approaching war could not be ignored. Stuart remounted his horse, kissed Flora one last time, and raced back to his command. Neither of them knew it would be the last time. An aide riding beside Stuart that night noted something unusual. The general, normally so boisterous and full of energy, was quiet. Somber. As if listening to something no one else could hear. When the aide asked if something was wrong, Stuart replied with words that would haunt those who heard them: the shadow of the near future was already upon him. Stuart seemed to know. Yellow Tavern, the last ride. May 11, 1864. The morning light fell cold and gray over the Virginia countryside as Stuart pushed his cavalry hard toward a crumbling, abandoned and cold Yellow Tavern, 6 miles north of Richmond. The crossroads there, where the Mountain Road and Telegraph Road converged, was the gateway to the Confederate capital. If Sheridan got through, Richmond itself was at risk. Stuart arrived hours before Sheridan, but his advantages ended there. He had brought approximately 4,500 men. Sheridan had nearly 10,000, and they were better armed. Stuart's troopers carried single-shot muzzle loaders. Sheridan's men were equipped with Spencer repeating carbines, weapons that could fire 7 rounds before reloading. The Union cavalry could pour out firepower that the Confederates simply couldn't match. The battle began in the early afternoon. Stuart's horse artillery opened up with devastating accuracy, tearing holes in the Union ranks and slowing their advance. For a time, it seemed the Confederates might hold. Stuart rode among his men constantly, encouraging, directing, rallying, visible and seemingly invincible in his scarlet-lined cape and plumed hat. Then came Custer. Brigadier General George Armstrong Custer, young, reckless, and brilliantly aggressive, launched his Michigan Cavalry Brigade in a ferocious assault on the Confederate left flank. Custer sent his dismounted 5th and 6th Michigan troopers forward first, pouring fire into the Confederate line, then unleashed his mounted 1st and 7th Michigan in a thundering charge. The Confederate line under General Lomax began to collapse. Stuart spurred his horse toward the collapsing line. This was the moment. This was where it always fell apart if the general wasn't there to hold it together. He drew his pistol and fired at the charging Union horsemen as they swept past him, rallying his men with his presence alone. For a breathless moment, it worked. The 1st Virginia Cavalry, Stuart's oldest regiment, the men who had ridden with him since the very beginning of the war, came charging back with a thunderous counterattack that hurled the Yankees back in confusion. The Michigan troopers retreated down the road, falling back through the dust and smoke. Stuart watched them go, pistol in hand, and allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. He never saw the man who shot him. A dismounted Union trooper, separated from his retreating comrades, moving through the chaos of the withdrawal, spotted a Confederate officer sitting high on his horse. The man was large, conspicuous, magnificent in his uniform. The trooper raised his .44 caliber revolver, took careful aim, and squeezed the trigger. The bullet struck Stuart in the right side, just below the ribs. It punched through his abdomen with savage force, piercing his intestines and severing blood vessels before lodging deep inside his body. Stuart lurched forward in his saddle. His famous black-plumed hat dropped from his head and fell to the ground. Captain Gustavus Dorsey, riding beside him, grabbed his arm in horror. "General, are you hit?" Stuart pressed a hand to his right side. He could feel the warmth of the blood soaking through his uniform. He looked at Dorsey with eyes that were already growing distant. "I'm afraid I am," he said quietly. "The identity of the man who fired that shot has never been definitively confirmed." Colonel Russell Alger of the 5th Michigan and General Custer himself both wrote that Private John Huff, a 48-year-old farmer-turned-soldier, reportedly a skilled marksman, fired the fatal shot. But no other evidence corroborated this, and the true identity of the man who killed J.E.B. Stuart remains one of the great mysteries of the Civil War. The agonizing journey. Stuart's men surrounded him instantly, shielding him from further harm, helping him down from his horse. He was in tremendous pain but refused to show weakness. He was offered a second horse, but the animal, sensing the chaos, became skittish and difficult to control. Stuart managed to ride it a short distance before his men finally found an ambulance. The Confederate capital of Richmond was only 6 miles away. In peacetime, the journey would have taken less than an hour. But this was not peacetime. Federal cavalry under Sheridan were pressing toward the city from multiple directions. Every road was potentially watched, every shortcut potentially dangerous. The ambulance driver was forced to take a circuitous, agonizing route through back roads and woodland paths. The ambulance itself was a crude, springless wagon. Every rut in the road, every stone, every bump sent shockwaves through Stuart's body as the bullet wound pulsed with agonizing heat. The 6-mile journey took 6 hours. Somewhere along the way, in the darkness and the pain, Stuart found his faith. He turned to the officers riding beside him and spoke quietly. "I don't know how this will turn out, but if it is God's will that I shall die, I am ready." They arrived at the home of Dr. Charles Brewer, Stuart's brother-in-law, on Gray Street in Richmond at 11 p.m. The city was under a kind of suspended dread. Word had already begun to spread that something terrible had happened at Yellow Tavern. Candlelight flickered in windows as citizens leaned out, watching the ambulance pass. Stuart was carried inside and laid in a bed. 4 of Richmond's finest physicians gathered around him, examining the wound with growing despair. The bullet had done what bullets to the abdomen almost always did in 1864, it had created a death sentence. The intestines were perforated. Internal bleeding was seeping through his body. There was nothing the doctors could do except manage his pain and wait. The final day. May 12, 1864. Stuart woke to his last morning. Despite the wound and the pain, his mind was sharp. He asked to dictate his will, a request that was completed with Major Henry McClellan, his adjutant, dutifully recording his wishes. Stuart could hear distant artillery as he spoke, and he asked about it. McClellan told him it was General Fitzhugh Lee's cavalry chasing the Federals east, away from Richmond. Stuart smiled faintly at the news. "God grant that they may be successful," he said. Then his expression became serious. "But I must be prepared for another world." President Jefferson Davis arrived to pay his respects. Davis stood at the bedside of one of his finest generals and asked how he was feeling. Stuart looked at the president directly. "Easy, but willing to die, if God and my country think I have fulfilled my destiny and done my duty." Davis left with tears in his eyes. Through the long hours of the day, visitors came and went. Officers who had ridden with Stuart for years stood in the doorway, unable to enter the room, unable to look at the man who had always seemed indestructible now lying pale and still in a bed. Women from Richmond society brought flowers and prayers. Children peered through windows. Stuart asked for news of the fighting constantly. Every time a dispatch arrived from the front, someone read it to him, and every time, whether the news was good or bad, Stuart found something encouraging to say. He was a general to the last breath. He asked about Flora. Where was his wife? Someone had sent word to her immediately, but travel in wartime Virginia was treacherous. She was coming as fast as she could. She wasn't fast enough. Rock of Ages. Around 7 p.m. on the evening of May 12, a clergyman entered the room and led everyone present in prayer. The room was full of people, officers, physicians, family members, servants, all standing silent, heads bowed, some weeping openly. When the prayer ended, Stuart spoke again. His voice was weaker now. The light in his eyes had changed, become softer, more distant, as if he were already partly somewhere else. He asked the clergyman to lead them in a hymn. Not just any hymn. Rock of Ages, Stuart said. It is my favorite. The voices in the room began to sing, softly at first, then with more conviction as the words of the old hymn filled the air. Stuart tried to sing along. For a moment, his lips moved with the words. But the breath that had carried him through 1,000 battles was failing now, and he could not finish the verse. He looked at the faces around him, the weeping men who had been his soldiers, his staff, his family in all but blood, and seemed to draw some comfort from what he saw. "I am going fast now," he said. "I am resigned. God's will be done." James Ewell Brown Stuart died at 7:38 p.m. on May 12, 1864. He was 31 years old. Flora Stuart arrived at the house on Gray Street at 11:30 that night, nearly 4 hours after her husband had drawn his last breath. She had not seen him since that hurried farewell 2 days before, when he had kissed her and ridden back to his men with the war pressing at his heels. She never remarried. For the rest of her long life, she died in 1923, she wore nothing but black. She was buried beside J.E.B on May 12, the anniversary of his death. Even in death, they arrived at the same place on the same day. The world that mourned him. General Robert E. Lee was fighting the terrible Battle of Spotsylvania when the note reached him. He read it once, then stood quietly for several minutes, composing himself before turning to face his staff. "Gentlemen, we have very bad news. General Stuart has been mortally wounded." He said nothing more. He returned to his command, directed the fighting through the day, and as midnight approached, received word that Stuart had died. He entered his tent alone. Later, those who were present that night recalled that Lee's voice had broken when he finally spoke. "I can scarcely think of him without weeping." Lee said something else that served as the finest epitaph any soldier could receive. "He never brought me a false piece of information." The South went into mourning. Newspapers across the Confederacy bordered their pages in black. Soldiers in the field, men who had ridden beside Stuart through years of blood and fire, wept without shame. Funeral services were held at St. James's Episcopal Church in Richmond on May 13. Stuart was buried at Hollywood Cemetery, in the same city he had ridden to defend with his last strength. The Confederacy had lost its eyes. Without Stuart's unmatched intelligence gathering, Lee would fight the remaining 11 months of the war increasingly blind. The end came less than a year later, at Appomattox, on April 9, 1865. What history buried? Here is what the textbooks rarely tell you. They tell you Stuart died at Yellow Tavern. They note his rank and the date. They move on. What they rarely describe is the physical reality of what a .44 caliber revolver bullet does to a human abdomen. The bullet that struck Stuart did not kill him quickly or cleanly. It punched through his right side and tore through his intestines, the tightly coiled, enormously complex network of organs that manages digestion and is exquisitely sensitive to trauma. When intestinal walls are perforated, their contents, acids, bacteria, waste, begin leaking into the sterile abdominal cavity. The result is peritonitis, a spreading, agonizing infection that fills the abdomen with inflammation, causes the organs to begin shutting down, and produces a fever that climbs relentlessly until the body can no longer sustain it. In 1864, there were no antibiotics. There was no surgical technique that could repair a perforated intestine with any reliable hope of success. There was no understanding of the bacterial mechanisms that were silently consuming Stuart from the inside. The doctors who attended him could offer morphine for the pain. Beyond that, they could do nothing but watch, and wait, and pray. Stuart endured this for more than 27 hours. 27 hours of mounting pain, rising fever, and the slow, irreversible failure of his body's systems. All while maintaining enough composure to dictate his will, receive the President of the Confederacy, comfort the men around him, and ask to sing a hymn. The history books give us the legend. The reality was a man in agony, refusing to show it, dying by inches while his country crumbled around him. The 6-hour ambulance ride, in a springless wagon, over unpaved Virginia roads, through the night, with a perforated intestine. Try to imagine that. The wait for Flora, who never arrived in time. Try to imagine that too. What history books often hide from us is not just the gruesome physical reality of how great men die, it is the human cost beneath the legend. Stuart was 31 years old. He had 3 small children. He had a wife who would mourn him for nearly 60 years. He had friends who wept for him, enemies who respected him, and a commander who could scarcely think of him without breaking. He was not a monument. He was a man. And in the end, all the plumes and capes and golden spurs could not stop a single bullet from a single anonymous soldier on a battlefield 6 miles from the city he gave his life to protect. The shadow that remained. There is a footnote to this story that history almost always omits. J.E.B. Stuart's father-in-law, Colonel Philip St. George Cook, the man who chose the Union over his family, the man Stuart despised so completely that he erased his name from his own son, survived the war. He was promoted to general in the Union Army. He outlived J.E.B. Stuart by nearly 20 years, dying in 1895. He never fully reconciled with his daughter Flora. He never spoke publicly about his son-in-law's death. Some silences are louder than anything history can record. J.E.B. Stuart is buried at Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond, Virginia. Whatever the verdict of history, one thing remains undeniable. On the morning of May 11, 1864, a man rode toward his last battle knowing, perhaps, that it was his last. He kissed his wife goodbye. He rallied his men. He rode to the sound of the guns. And when the bullet found him, he did not curse or rage or beg. He straightened in his saddle, pressed his hand to his side, and told the man beside him, quietly, that he was afraid he was hit. That's how legends end. Not with fire and thunder, but with a quiet voice, a hand.